Now let's talk about Reagan's foreign policy, which aside from his economic focus was his most uh, highest priority. So Reagan, as I mentioned, really wanted to hasten the end of the Cold War, and he saw his moment because the Soviet Union was struggling. So Reagan decided that one of the best ways to defeat the Soviet Union was simply to bankrupt them. And so Reagan supported drastic increases in military spending because he knew that the Soviet Union would be forced to match this American military buildup and spend money they really couldn't afford to do this. One of the proposals that Reagan has in this buildup of military technology is an initiative that is dubbed Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. People dubbed it Star Wars because they argued that it was a work of science fiction, that the technology to create such a proposal did not exist. Basically, what Reagan wanted to do was to develop technology that would be designed to intercept and destroy missiles from space. Again, doesn't really exist. When he first proposes this in 1983, coincidentally, the same year Return of the Jedi, an actual Star Wars movie, comes out. But the more important thing in proposing this, even though, again, it's not technologically possible when he proposes this, is the fact that this feeds into this Cold War notion of rhetoric and heavy military buildup. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be realistic to ruffle the feathers of the Soviet Union. Okay, it's just enough that you're talking about this thing that could be considered a military buildup, even if you can't practically build it. The United States is going to engage in some military interventions throughout the 1980s. In Grenada, a small island in the Caribbean, they will send in the military to overthrow a pro-Cuban government, again under the idea of containment. The United States is briefly involved in Lebanon in a civil war that breaks out between Christian government and Muslim insurgents. However, when a bombing in Lebanon killed 241 American servicemen stationed there, the public will to sustain involvement in Lebanon was not there. There's still this very fresh memory of the Vietnam War. And again, that Vietnam syndrome we talked about, right? That reluctance to really deploy troops. So once you have that kind of catastrophic bombing initially, American popular opinion turns against getting involved in Lebanon, and we end up withdrawing our troops there. Now, one of the things that Reagan is going to do is he's going to end Carter's policy of privileging human rights, and Reagan's going to go back to the tradition within the Cold War of American presidents and administrations focusing on who's anti-communist and not so much caring about their human rights record. Partly this is inspired by a 1979 essay by Jean Kirkpatrick, in which she argued that America's best foreign policy interests lay in opposing totalitarian communists, but being willing to prop up authoritarian but non-communist regimes. So having a dictator is okay if he's not communist. We can deal with that, right? So again, the priority is going to be focusing on nations that are very much anti-communist, not whether they are democracies. And Kirkpatrick is actually going to be named ambassador to the United Nations by Reagan. So because of this shift in policy, the United States will continue to ignore human rights abuses in places like Guatemala, in which this actually does classify as a genocide against Mayan people in the 1980s, and also in El Salvador. But really, the American interventionist strategy by Reagan is going to become most challenged when we're talking about the Iran-Contra scandal. So when Reagan came into office in 1981, And he decided that human rights was no longer going to be the sort of top priority, that we were going to return back to supporting anti-communist regimes. This does have an immediate policy change in Latin America, particularly in Nicaragua. So the United States had last been heavily involved in Nicaragua back in the 1930s, when we had sent in troops to try to oppose a more radical government, and which had resulted in the Somoza family gaining control after they assassinated General Augusto Cesar Sandino. So the Somoza family had been ruling Nicaragua for decades with an iron fist, and they were being increasingly opposed by a communist group calling themselves the Sandinistas after the murdered Sandino. And Reagan opposed the Sandinistas when they gained power in Nicaragua and began to blockade and place an economic boycott on the country. He believes that with the Sandinistas ascendant in power in Nicaragua, that they would support other communist rebels across Latin America, and again, this would lead to a domino effect of new communist nations, and therefore would be a failure of containment. So by 1983, Reagan's administration had increased both money and military supplies to a group called the Contras, who had been trained by the CIA to oppose and overthrow the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So again, we're returning to a policy of regime change that we had seen earlier in the Cold War. However, Congress was very disturbed by the escalating amount of aid, and in 1984, they placed a ban on military aid to the Contras, making it illegal to continue to fund them. However, behind the scenes, Reagan's administration violated the terms of the ban starting in 1986 by secretly selling weapons to Iran and then taking the cash from those weapon sales and funding it to the Contras. This scandal breaks when investigative journalists find out about these illegal sales to Iran to bankroll the Contras, again, contrary to federal law, in 1986 and 1987. And this leads to a nationwide scandal. Oliver North, who at this time is in the military and is one of the sort of people focused on in these trials, argues that, he was told to do this, right? He was simply following orders. Because there was a lot of willful destruction of evidence, in the end, 11 people were convicted of perjury, lying under oath, or destroying evidence, but nobody was convicted for breaking federal law, and nobody was impeached for what technically was a crime of treason. So this is kind of interesting, is that Oliver North becomes sort of the fall guy for this. We don't seriously see Congress going after Reagan or his vice president, George H.W. Bush, over the Iran-Contra scandal. And don't feel too bad for Oliver North. He's had a very interesting career as a political pundit since this point. But basically, again, because so much evidence that was required to secure more serious convictions had been destroyed on purpose, there was very little that could be done otherwise in the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, Reagan's primary focus, again, even though he's getting very deeply involved in places like Nicaragua, is in defeating the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And during his second term in office, the counterpart that he has in the Soviet Union is Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev comes to power in a time of a teetering Soviet economy. The Helsinki Accords that have been passed during the 1970s, which required communist nations to grant more civil liberties to their people, were also creating some unrest in the population. And so what Gorbachev did when he came into office is he basically talked about embracing reforms to strengthen the Soviet Union. And he proposed two reforms, perestroika and glasnost. So perestroika means restructuring. So what Gorbachev meant by this was that he was going to revamp the Soviet economy to allow elements of capitalism, but not go completely capitalist, right? We're still a communist state. And he felt like this would address some of the economic problems of the Soviet Union and some of the demands by the Soviet people for more consumer products. Glasnost means openness. So here, Gorbachev is saying we're willing to allow more freedom of expression, more freedom of the press, right? So that we can have a more productive conversation about the future of the Soviet Union. In reality, this is just going to open the floodgates of complaints, right, for people who had lived under Soviet rule. Now, one of the things after Gorbachev comes in office that starts to happen is we start to see a better working relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States, as Gorbachev and Reagan will meet repeatedly to talk about de-escalating the Cold War. It worked for both Reagan and Gorbachev to decrease military spending, right, that affected their budgets. And a series of talks held between 1985 and 1987 helped to make significant progress, reducing the amount of nuclear missiles in Soviet and American stockpiles, and also being the catalyst for the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in the late 80s.